Wade Calloway had pictured this gate 1,000 different ways, and none of them matched what he was looking at now. Rust had eaten through the bottom hinge. The Calloway Ranch sign hung sideways, one chain gone, swinging slow in a wind that smelled like dry grass and diesel. He'd driven 11 hours from Spokane with his hands tight on the wheel the whole way, and now that he was here, parked on the shoulder of the same gravel road he'd walked as a boy, he couldn't make his foot move to the gas pedal. Somewhere past that gate sat a tool shed with his name on the deed and a padlock his father had put there before he died. Nobody in Briar Hollow, Montana, had opened it in 3 years. Wade wasn't sure he was ready to be the one who finally did. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ranch had been split down the middle 18 months earlier, on paper anyway, by a probate judge in Fergus County who'd never set foot on the property and had no idea what that division actually meant to the two people it affected. 600 acres of grazing land, a farmhouse with a bad roof, 2 barns, and a shed no bigger than a one-car garage, sitting off by itself near the tree line where the property dropped toward the creek. Wade's sister Lena got the house. She got the barns, the equipment, the water rights, and every acre a rancher would actually want. Wade got the shed. At the reading of the will, their father's lawyer had said it plainly, no explanation attached. Wade gets the tool shed and everything inside it. Lena gets the rest. Sign here. Lena had looked at Wade across that conference table like he'd rigged the whole thing somehow, like a locked 10-by-12 shed was some kind of insult dressed up as an inheritance. She hadn't said much. She didn't have to. The two of them hadn't spoken more than a few clipped sentences since the funeral, and that silence had only gotten heavier once the will made it official that their father, Russell Calloway, had drawn a line between his children that neither of them understood. Wade got out of the truck. The gate groaned when he pushed it, loud enough to startle a pair of magpies off the fence line. He walked the long driveway on foot, past the house where a light was on in the kitchen window, past the near barn where Lena's truck sat parked at an angle that told him she'd left in a hurry that morning. He didn't go to the house. Not yet. He cut across the field toward the tree line, toward the shed, because 3 years of wondering what his father had locked away in there had finally worn him down to nothing but the need to know. The padlock was newer than the shed itself. A heavy brass thing bolted through a hasp Russell had clearly installed himself, the welds rough and uneven the way his father's welds always were. Wade had the key. He'd carried it on his ring for 3 years without using it, through 2 apartments and 1 failed engagement and a job he'd quit twice and gone back to once, because some part of him had known that opening this door would mean something he wasn't ready to face. He stood in front of it now, with the key already in his hand. His knuckles had gone white around it without him noticing. He thought about his mother, gone 11 years now, and the way she used to say Russell kept his feelings in that shed the way other men kept them in a bottle. He thought about the last real conversation he'd had with his father, for months before the stroke that killed him. A phone call that had ended with Russell saying something Wade hadn't understood at the time and had turned over in his mind every day since. "You'll know what to do with it when you see it." That was all he'd said. No explanation. Just that, and then a change of subject, and then nothing, because 6 weeks later Russell Calloway was gone, and there was no asking him what he'd meant. The key turned easier than Wade expected. The lock fell open with a small metallic click that seemed too quiet for how loud it felt in his chest. He slid it free, pulled the hasp back, and put his hand flat against the door. Behind him, gravel crunched under tires. He turned and saw Lena's truck coming up the drive faster than it needed to, dust rising behind it in a long pale trail against the afternoon light. She'd seen him from the house. Of course she had. She parked hard, got out without closing the door behind her, and started across the field toward him with the kind of walk that meant she had plenty to say and had been saving all of it. "You couldn't wait," she called out, closing the distance. 3 years, and you couldn't give me one more day to figure out what I'm supposed to feel about this." Wade didn't answer right away. His hand was still on the door. Whatever was on the other side of it had waited 3 years already. It had waited longer than that, if he was honest with himself, because his father hadn't built this shed last month or last year. He'd built it back when Wade was still a teenager who thought his old man barely noticed him, back before the falling out that had sent Wade 2 states away for the better part of 2 decades, back before any of the three of them could have guessed how this would end. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," Wade said. "I just need to see what he left." Lena stopped a few feet short of him, arms crossed, jaw tight in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of their father. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Wade pulled the door open, and the smell that came out, motor oil and cedar and something else underneath that he couldn't place, hit him hard enough that he had to steady himself against the frame. Lena went still beside him. Whatever she'd expected to see over 3 years of wondering, it wasn't this. Neither had he. Within a week, there would be a reporter from the Fergus County Herald standing in that same doorway, and after that a stringer from a Billings television station. And after that, people Wade had never met leaving comments on a news story neither he nor Lena had asked for, all of them trying to make sense of what their father had spent the last years of his life quietly building behind a locked door. But to understand what waited inside that shed and why Russell Calloway had split his ranch the way he did, you have to go back to the summer everything between this family first went wrong, 17 years before Wade ever touched that padlock. 17 years earlier, Briar Hollow was the kind of town where the feed store doubled as the news desk, and everybody knew whose cattle had gotten out before the rancher himself did. Russell Calloway had run the family spread since he was 22, inheriting it from his own father in a year, so dry the creek stopped running for 3 months straight. By the time Wade turned 16 and Lena turned 19, Russell had built the place into something solid, 600 acres of good grazing land, a herd he'd bred up from nothing, and a reputation as a man who paid his debts on time and expected everyone else to do the same. Patsy Calloway kept the books and kept the family running underneath Russell's gruffness, the way she'd done for 23 years of marriage. She had a laugh that carried across the yard and a way of knowing exactly when one of her kids needed to talk before they knew it themselves. Wade got his patience from her. Lena got her stubbornness from Russell, though neither of them would have admitted the resemblance at the time. Lena had always been the one who wanted the ranch. From the time she could walk, she trailed after Russell through the calving barn, asking questions he was only too happy to answer. And by 19, she could read a cow's temperament from 30 feet off and knew the water rotation better than the hired hands did. Wade loved the place too, but differently. He liked engines more than livestock. He spent his afternoons in the equipment shed behind the barn, not the one that would later hold whatever secret his father locked away, taking apart the old baler and putting it back together just to understand how it worked. Russell used to stand in the doorway sometimes, arms crossed, watching him work without saying much, and Wade never knew back then whether that silence meant approval or disappointment. Dale Osborne worked the ranch as a hired hand that summer, a few years older than Wade, quiet and steady, the kind of man Russell trusted enough to leave in charge when he drove to Great Falls for supplies. Dale and Wade became friends the way young men do when they're stuck doing the same fence work all day. And it was Dale who first noticed that something had shifted between Russell and his son sometime around July. It started small. Russell began asking Wade to handle jobs that used to go to Lena, moving cattle between pastures, meeting the vet at the far gate, tasks Lena had done since she was 14 without complaint. Lena noticed. She didn't say anything at first because that wasn't how the Calloways handled things, but Wade could see it building in her, the way she'd go quiet at dinner and leave the table before dessert. The trouble had a name, and its name was money. A drought had hit 2 counties over the summer before, and while Briar Hollow's rain had held up well enough, cattle prices had cratered along with everyone else's, and Russell had borrowed heavier than he'd ever borrowed before to keep the herd fed through a lean spring. He didn't tell either of his kids how bad it had gotten. He told Patsy, late at night, in conversations Wade only pieced together years later from things his mother let slip. Russell had started looking at the ranch the way a man looks at a puzzle he's not sure he can solve, and somewhere in that worry he made a decision he never fully explained to anyone, not then and not for years afterward. He decided the ranch needed to go to one child, not split between 2, because splitting it would mean splitting a debt neither of them could carry alone. And he decided, without asking Lena or Wade what either of them wanted, that it should go to Lena. He came to Wade first, the way men like Russell always seemed to handle things nobody wanted witnessed, out by the equipment shed on a Sunday evening in August. He told Wade plainly that the ranch would go to Lena when the time came, that Wade had a good head for machines, and ought to think about a trade in town instead of tying himself to land that might not survive another bad year. He said it like a kindness. Wade didn't take it as one. I've worked this place same as her, Wade said. He was 17. His voice cracked on the word same, and he hated himself for it. I know you have, Russell said. This isn't about what you've earned. It's about what'll still be standing in 20 years. Wade didn't understand what that meant. Not fully, not that night. He only understood that his father had made a decision about his life and hadn't asked him a single question first. He walked back to the house angry in a way he didn't have words for yet, and he didn't tell Lena what Russell had said, because some stubborn, wounded part of him didn't want her to know he'd been cut out before either of them had even finished growing up. That should have been the end of it. A hard conversation absorbed into the ordinary friction of a working ranch, forgotten the way most hard conversations eventually are. It wasn't, because 3 weeks later, Dale Osborne came to Wade with something he'd overheard near the equipment shed, something involving a lawyer from Lewistown, and a phrase Wade had never expected to hear attached to his father's name: irrevocable trust. Wade didn't know what an irrevocable trust was, not at 17, but he knew the word irrevocable well enough to understand it meant permanent, and permanent was the last thing he wanted attached to a decision his father had made without him in the room. He asked Dale to tell him everything he'd heard, and Dale, looking like he already regretted opening his mouth, laid it out as best he remembered it. A lawyer named Frank Odom had come out from Lewistown on a Tuesday while Wade was at school, sat with Russell in the kitchen for the better part of 2 hours, and left with a folder under his arm. Dale had been fixing a fence post near the window and caught pieces of it through the screen. Something about protecting the herd from being split. Something about naming Lena as sole beneficiary once Russell was gone, with Wade left out of the land entirely. Wade confronted his father that same week. He didn't plan it out, didn't rehearse what he'd say the way he probably should have. He just walked into the kitchen while Russell was going over feed receipts at the table and asked him straight out if he was cutting Wade out of the will. Russell set his pen down slow, the way he did when he was buying himself time to think. Where'd you hear that? Doesn't matter where I heard it. Is it true? It's not that simple, Wade. Feels pretty simple to me. Russell rubbed a hand over his jaw, and for a moment Wade thought he might actually explain himself, might finally say the thing underneath all of it. Instead, he said the ranch had debt neither of his kids fully understood, that splitting it down the middle someday would leave both of them holding half of something that couldn't support either one, and that he'd rather one of them inherit something whole than two of them inherit something broken. He said Lena had the temperament for the work and the years of experience to prove it, and that Wade had options Lena didn't, a knack for machines that could take him somewhere off the ranch entirely if he wanted it. So you already decided, Wade said. For both of us, I decided what I think keeps this family from losing everything. You decided what keeps me out of it. Russell didn't have an answer for that one. Or if he did, he didn't say it out loud, and the silence between them stretched long enough that Wade turned and left the kitchen before either of them could make it worse. He didn't tell Lena. He told himself it was because she had enough weighing on her already, chasing down a vet bill that had come in higher than expected. But the truth, the one he wouldn't admit to himself until years later, was that some wounded part of him wanted to punish his father by keeping her in the dark, wanted somebody else in that house to feel the same blindsided sting he was carrying. It didn't stay hidden long. Small towns don't hold on to secrets any better than small families do, and within a month Lena had heard a version of it too, garbled by the time it reached her, filtered through a cousin who'd heard it from someone at the bank. She came to Wade first, not their father, arms crossed on the porch steps the way she'd stand years later the day he finally opened that shed. Is it true Dad's cutting you out? Looks that way. Why didn't you tell me? Wade didn't have a clean answer, and the not answering said more than any excuse would have. Lena's face did something complicated then, anger and hurt, and something that looked almost like guilt, because whatever resentment had been building in her all summer over Russell handing Wade's old chores back to her, she never once wanted it to come at the cost of cutting her brother out of his own inheritance. I didn't ask for this, she said. I know. I'd split it with you. 50-50. That's how it should have always been. That's not up to you, Wade said, and he heard how bitter it sounded even as it left his mouth, heard that he was aiming it at her when the person he was actually angry at was standing in the kitchen 100 yards away. Lena didn't say anything back. She just stood up and walked into the house, and that was the first real distance either of them put between themselves. Months before the actual leaving, months before anyone involved understood how far this would eventually go. Russell noticed the two of them had stopped talking easy the way they used to. Noticed it at dinner, in the long, ordinary silences that used to be filled with Lena teasing Wade about something or Wade needling her back, and he never once connected it to the conversation he'd had with Frank Odom in the kitchen. He believed, the way people believe things that let them sleep at night, that he was protecting his family from a future he could see coming and they couldn't. He wasn't a cruel man. He built fences because he thought fences kept things safe, and it never occurred to him that the fence he was building now sat squarely between his own two children. What Russell didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Frank Odom's folder wasn't finished. There was one more visit still coming, one more conversation in that kitchen that would change everything again, and it would happen before the month was out. Frank Odom came back to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks later, and this time Wade was home when the car pulled up, a dusty sedan he recognized from the first visit. He watched through the equipment shed window as Odom carried a different folder inside, thinner than before, and he watched Patsy meet him at the door with a face that told Wade his mother already knew whatever this visit was about. He didn't go inside. He told himself it wasn't his business anymore, since his father had already made clear how much of the business belonged to him. But the truth was closer to fear than pride. He didn't want to hear whatever came out of that kitchen next. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was Patsy who finally told him, 3 days later, sitting across from him at the kitchen table while Russell was out checking fence line on the north pasture. She had a way of delivering hard news plainly, without dressing it up, and she didn't dress this up either. Your father's not cutting you out because he thinks less of you, she said. He's doing it because of the loan. Wade had heard pieces of the money trouble before, the drought 2 counties over, the feed prices, but he hadn't understood how deep it ran until his mother laid it out. Russell had borrowed against the ranch 2 years earlier to get through a bad calving season, more than he'd ever told either of his children, and the bank had structured the loan in a way that made the land itself the collateral. If Russell died with the property split evenly between 2 heirs the way a normal will would do it, the bank could call the loan due on both halves at once, and neither half would generate enough income on its own to cover the payment. Split 50-50, the ranch would likely fail within a few years, sold off in pieces to cover a debt neither Wade nor Lena had any part in creating. So he's giving it all to her instead, Wade said. He's trying to keep it alive, Patsy said. One strong operation instead of 2 weak ones. Frank explained it different ways for 2 hours, and it all comes down to that. And what happens to me? Patsy reached across the table and took his hand, something she hadn't done since he was small. He's setting money aside for you separately. Not land. He knows you don't want to spend your life out here anyway, not the way your sister does. He thinks he's giving you a way out that doesn't leave you chained to a debt you never agreed to. It didn't feel like a way out. It felt like being told, gently and with good intentions, that he didn't belong to the place he'd grown up in. Wade understood the arithmetic even as a teenager, understood in some cold, practical way that his father wasn't wrong about the numbers. He just couldn't make the understanding sit right next to the hurt. He confronted Russell one more time, out by the barn on a Sunday that had started clear and turned to rain by afternoon, both of them getting soaked and neither willing to be the one who suggested going inside. Wade told his father he understood the money now, understood the loan and the bank and all of it, and that he still thought Russell should have told him from the start instead of letting him hear it secondhand through Dale Osborne's ears pressed near a window. You're right, Russell said, and it was the first time Wade had ever heard his father admit fault outright. I should have sat you down myself. I was a coward about it. I knew it had hurt you, and I put off saying it because I didn't want to watch your face while I did. That doesn't fix it. No, Russell said. It doesn't. But I need you to hear the rest of it, because there's a piece your mother probably didn't get to yet. Russell told him then about a separate account he'd started building the year Wade turned 14. Small deposits skimmed off the cattle sales whenever the year was good enough to spare them, meant to grow into something that would set Wade up wherever he decided to land, whether that was a trade school or a shop of his own or something neither of them had thought of yet. It wasn't the ranch. Russell was honest enough to say it wasn't a fair trade for the ranch. Not really, but it was what he had to offer, and he asked Wade to trust that there was more coming even if he couldn't explain all of it yet. Wade didn't trust it. Not that day. standing in the rain with his father's rare apology still ringing strange in his ears, and not for a long while after. But he nodded, because there wasn't much else to do, and he walked back to the house alone while Russell stayed out by the barn a few minutes longer. Watching the rain come down over land, he was quietly trying to save for a daughter who wanted it, and a son he was terrified of losing. What none of them could have predicted. Not Russell with his ledgers, not Patsy with her plain honesty, not Wade standing soaked and furious in the yard, was that the real break in this family wouldn't come from a will or a loan at all. It would come 8 months later from a decision Wade made entirely on his own, one that would send him away from Briar Hollow for the better part of 2 decades and leave Russell building something in secret that neither of his children would understand until long after he was gone. 8 months passed with the Calloway house settling into an uneasy truce. Wade went back to school that fall, worked the ranch on weekends the way he always had, and did his best not to think too hard about the account Russell had mentioned or the will that still named Lena as sole heir to the land. Lena, for her part, threw herself harder into ranch work than ever, as if she could somehow earn back the fairness her father had already decided didn't apply here. The two of them talked again, mostly, though something had gone thin between them that hadn't been thin before. It was Dale Osborne who changed the course of things, though not on purpose, and not for a long while did anyone blame him for it. Dale had a cousin in Spokane who ran a small engine repair shop and needed a second set of hands, someone who could rebuild a transmission without being told twice how. Dale mentioned it to Wade one afternoon in March, half as a joke, the kind of thing you say to a friend without expecting him to take it seriously. Wade took it seriously. He was 18 by then, out of high school, restless in a way that had less to do with engines and more to do with a house where his own father had quietly decided the ranch wasn't his to inherit. He didn't tell Russell right away. He told Patsy first, one evening in the kitchen while his father was out at the sale barn, and his mother listened without trying to talk him out of it, though he could see it cost her something to stay quiet. She only asked him one question: "Are you leaving because you want to build a life, or because you're still angry at your father?" Wade didn't have a clean answer for that either, and he suspected even at 18 that the truth was some tangled version of both. He told Russell 2 weeks before he left, standing in the same equipment shed where his father had first told him about the ranch going to Lena. Russell didn't try to stop him, not outright, though Wade could see something in his face fall when he said, spoken out loud. His father asked him if this was about the will. Wade said it wasn't, not entirely, and that was as honest as he could manage at the time. Russell nodded slow and said, "If that's what you want, then that's what you should do," and something about how easily he said it made Wade angrier than any argument would have. "You're not even going to ask me to stay. Would it change anything if I did?" Wade didn't answer, because the honest answer was he didn't know, and admitting that felt worse than saying nothing at all. Russell reached out and shook his son's hand instead of anything softer, the way men of his generation handled goodbyes they didn't have better words for, and told him the account was still there, still growing, and would be waiting whenever Wade wanted it, whether that meant coming home or building something new somewhere else entirely. Lena took it harder than either of them expected. She'd assumed, in the quiet way people assume things about family without saying them out loud, that whatever tension existed between Wade and their father, it wouldn't actually break the family apart. When Wade told her he was leaving for Spokane, she didn't argue with him the way Russell hadn't. But she asked him one thing that stuck with him for years afterward. "If you leave now, over this, you're proving him right. That you never really wanted the ranch anyway." "Maybe I don't know what I want." "Then don't leave until you do." He left anyway, 3 weeks later, in a truck he'd bought secondhand with money he'd saved from 2 summers of ranch work, a bag of clothes and a toolbox in the bed, and a plan that amounted to little more than Dale's cousin's shop and a room above a hardware store that rented cheap. He told himself it wasn't permanent. He told himself he'd be back within a year, once he'd proven something to himself that he couldn't quite name, something about being more than the son his father had quietly written out of the land. Russell drove him to the edge of the property the morning he left, the two of them barely speaking, and at the gate, the same gate that would hang crooked and half-rusted 17 years later when Wade came back to open a padlocked shed. Russell said something Wade didn't understand at the time and turned over in his mind for years afterward. "Whatever you decide to build out there, keep the tools. A man who keeps his tools always has a way back to where he started." Wade thought it was just his father being his father, cryptic and stiff with feeling he never learned to say plainly. He didn't know then that Russell had already started something in the equipment shed that night, alone, after Wade's taillights disappeared down the county road, something that would take him the better part of the next 17 years to finish. He didn't know that his father would keep building it in secret, year after year, long after Wade stopped calling regularly and long after Lena stopped asking when her brother might come home. He only knew that he was leaving, and that leaving felt, in that moment, like the only door still open to him. Spokane didn't feel like home for a long time, and Wade let it stay that way on purpose, as if refusing to plant roots there was some kind of loyalty to the place he'd left. He worked at Dale's cousin's shop for 2 years, learning engines the way other men learn scripture, by repetition and failure, and the occasional flash of understanding that made all the failure worth it. He was good at it, better than good, eventually, and by the time he was 23 he'd saved enough to buy into the shop as a partner, and by 26 he'd bought his partner out entirely and put his own name on the sign. He called home on Sundays at first, then every other Sunday, then whenever the week had been slow enough that guilt caught up with him. Patsy always answered warm, always asked about the shop, and never once about the ranch, as if she understood that questions about Briar Hollow might close a door Wade was still deciding whether to keep open. Russell rarely came to the phone. When he did, the conversations ran short and practical, weather and cattle prices and the state of the roads, nothing underneath any of it that either man knew how to reach. Lena stayed. She took over more of the operation each year, as Russell's knees gave him trouble and his patience for paperwork wore thin. And by the time she was 30, she was running the ranch in every way that mattered, even though the deed still sat in Russell's name. She married a man named Curtis Foss, a large animal vet from 2 counties over, quiet and steady in a way that suited her. And the two of them built a life at the edge of the property that looked, from a distance, like exactly the kind of stability their father had been trying to protect all those years ago. She and Wade spoke less as the years went by, not out of anger exactly, more out of the particular erosion that happens when 2 people stop sharing a daily life and have nothing left to fill the silence, but old grievances neither wants to reopen. She sent a card when his engagement fell through, in his early 30s. He sent flowers when Curtis's father passed. It was the kind of relationship siblings settle into when neither one knows how to say, "I miss how we used to be," without also admitting how much time has already been lost. Russell, meanwhile, spent his evenings out at the old equipment shed, doing something none of them fully understood. Patsy knew he'd started building something in there not long after Wade left, some kind of project he worked on a few hours most nights. But Russell had never been a man who explained himself while a thing was still unfinished, and Patsy had learned decades earlier not to push him before he was ready to talk. She used to bring him coffee out there sometimes, set it on the workbench without asking questions, and he'd thank her without looking up from whatever he was doing. Patsy passed when Wade was 31, a heart attack in her sleep that gave nobody the chance to say goodbye properly. Wade came home for the funeral, his first time back on Briar Hollow soil in 9 years. And standing at his mother's graveside next to a father who'd aged more than 9 years should have accounted for, and a sister who held his hand through the service without quite looking at him, Wade felt the full weight of everything Spokane had let him avoid feeling for almost a decade. He and Russell talked more in the 3 days he stayed for the funeral than they had in the previous 5 years combined, though most of it stayed shallow, logistics and old memories, nothing that touched the actual distance between them. On the last night before Wade drove back to Spokane, Russell walked him out to his truck and stood there a long moment before speaking. "I know I made a mess of things back when you were a boy," Russell said. "I've had a long time to think about it. Longer than I wanted. It's a long time ago now, Dad. Doesn't mean it stopped mattering." Russell looked out toward the tree line, toward the shed, though Wade didn't think anything of it at the time. "I'm working on something. Been at it a good while. It's not finished yet. And I'm not going to explain it before it is, because I've learned the hard way that explaining things too early just gives people the wrong idea of what they're looking at." "Working on what?" "You'll know when you see it," Russell said. And that was all he'd give, the same maddening cryptic weight Wade remembered from the morning he left for Spokane all those years before. Wade let it go, because pushing his father rarely got him anywhere. And he drove back to Spokane the next morning with a grief he hadn't fully processed and a curiosity about that shed that would sit unanswered for another 8 years. Russell died on a Tuesday in early spring. A stroke that took him fast enough that nobody got the chance to be there. Found by Curtis when he stopped by to drop off a part for the tractor and noticed Russell hadn't come out to meet him the way he always did. Wade got the call from Lena, her voice flat with the particular shock of losing the second parent when you told yourself you were already braced for it. He drove the 11 hours to Briar Hollow that same night, and it was at the reading of the will 4 days later that he learned exactly what his father had decided to leave him, and exactly what he decided to leave Lena, and understood for the first time that his father's last words to him about that shed had not been idle. The lawyer who read the will wasn't Frank Odom, who'd retired years earlier, but a younger associate named Cassidy Marsh who'd inherited the Calloway file along with half the ranchers in Fergus County. She read it plainly, the way lawyers do when they've delivered enough hard news to know that softening it rarely helps. The ranch, the house, the barns, the herd, and every acre of grazing land went to Lena Calloway Foss. Outright, no conditions attached. Wade Calloway received the padlocked toolshed near the tree line and everything contained within it, along with a sealed letter Russell had left with the firm to be opened only once the shed itself had been opened, not before. Lena hadn't looked surprised. She'd looked, if anything, like she'd been expecting this exact outcome for years and had simply been waiting to see how it would finally land. Wade had looked at the shed clause twice, certain he'd misheard it, and asked Cassidy Marsh to repeat the terms, which she did, patiently, without any indication that she found the arrangement half as strange as Wade did. "That's it? A shed? That's what the will specifies," Cassidy said. "Your father was very particular about the wording. He came in himself to finalize it about 2 years before he passed and made a point of reviewing every line more than once." 2 years. Wade did the math without meaning to. 2 years before Russell died, put the final version of the will right around the time Wade had last visited, the Christmas after Patsy's 3rd anniversary. A short, strained visit where Russell had mentioned the shed again in passing, and Wade had let it slide past him the way he'd let it slide for years. Lena didn't say anything until they were both out in the parking lot, standing by their separate trucks in a silence that had 18 months still to run before either of them would break it for good. "You think this is fair?" she finally asked. Not accusing exactly, just tired. The particular tired of a woman who'd spent 15 years earning a ranch her father had already decided to leave her, and now had to wonder if she'd been trusted with it or just handed a consolation prize dressed up as a birthright. "I don't know what it is," Wade said. "I don't know what's even in there." "He never told you anything?" "All those calls. He never told anybody anything. That was kind of his whole thing." It came out sharper than Wade meant it. And he saw it land, saw something close behind Lena's eyes the way it always used to when their father's silence became the wall between them instead of the bridge it should have been. She got in her truck without saying goodbye. Wade drove back to the motel on the edge of town and lay awake most of that first night, doing the same kind of math he'd been doing since he was 17, trying to figure out what a padlock shed could possibly be worth compared to 600 acres and a working herd, and coming up, every time, with an answer that made no sense at all. He stayed in Briar Hollow 11 days after the funeral, handling paperwork, helping Curtis move Russell's truck into the near barn, sitting through 2 more meetings with Cassidy Marsh about the estate's finances. He didn't open the shed during that stretch. He told himself it was because there was too much else demanding his attention: the funeral costs, the property taxes, the sheer administrative weight of closing out a life. The truth sat closer to fear. Whatever his father had built in there over those 17 years, alone and secret, working by lantern light most evenings according to Curtis, who'd seen the glow from the near barn more nights than he could count. Wade wasn't ready to find out it might be nothing. A pile of scrap. A hobby that never went anywhere. Some private grief project that would explain everything and nothing at once. He went back to Spokane without opening it. He told himself a month, maybe 2, enough time to get his head straight and come back prepared for whatever it turned out to be. The month became a year. The year became 3. The shed sitting locked and untouched behind a ranch that had quietly, steadily, become entirely Lena's in every practical sense, while Wade's inheritance sat gathering dust and rumor in equal measure. Because in a town like Briar Hollow, a locked shed with a dead man's name attached to it doesn't stay quiet for long, no matter how far away the man who's supposed to open it happens to live. It was Curtis, in the end, who finally pushed things forward, calling Wade on a Tuesday evening 3 years after the funeral to say that people in town had started asking questions again, that a county surveyor doing routine work near the property line had mentioned the shed to someone at the feed store, and that whatever was sitting behind that padlock, Curtis thought it was past time somebody found out. Wade sat with the phone against his ear for a long moment after Curtis said his piece, looking out his own kitchen window at a Spokane evening that suddenly felt very far away from where his real life had always been waiting, and told him he'd be there within the week. Wade's hand was still flat against the shed door when the smell hit him, motor oil and cedar, and something underneath it he couldn't name, and Lena stood close enough beside him now that he could hear her breath catch the same way his had. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Wade pushed the door the rest of the way open and stepped into the dim light, filtering through a single dust-caked window on the far wall. The shed wasn't storage. Wade understood that within the first 3 seconds, and understanding it did nothing to prepare him for what he was actually looking at. Along the near wall stood a workbench, cluttered but organized in the exact particular way Russell had always kept his tools, and above it, mounted on a pegboard, hung dozens of small metal parts Wade recognized immediately because he'd spent his whole childhood around machines just like them. Gears, bearings, hand-forged brackets, and in the center of the shed, covered by a canvas tarp gone stiff with age, sat something roughly the size and shape of a small tractor. Lena reached the tarp before Wade did. She pulled it back slow, and dust rose in the shaft of window light. And underneath sat a machine neither of them had ever seen anything quite like, not exactly a tractor, and not exactly anything else either, some kind of hybrid contraption built from parts that looked scavenged from 3 or 4 different decades of farm equipment, welded and fitted together with a precision that made Wade's chest go tight, because he recognized his father's hand in every joint of it, the same rough, careful welds from the padlock hasp scaled up into something enormous and strange, and clearly, unmistakably, purposeful. "What is this?" Lena said, not really asking Wade so much as asking the shed itself. Wade circled it slowly. There was a small brass plate riveted to the frame near what looked like an engine housing, and when he crouched to read it, his throat closed up before he got through the second line. "Built for Wade and Lena," both the plate read, in Russell's own hand stamped into the metal. "So neither one of you ever has to choose between the land and the water again." Neither of them understood it yet, not fully, standing there in the half-dark with dust still settling around them. It would take another 2 days, and a call to an agricultural engineer out of Bozeman that Curtis insisted on making, before anyone understood exactly what Russell Calloway had spent the last 17 years of his life quietly building in that shed. A low-cost water reclamation system, designed from scratch using parts he'd scavenged and modified himself, meant to pull irrigation runoff back out of the creek bed and recirculate it across dry pasture, the exact kind of technology that ranchers across 3 counties had been paying tens of thousands of dollars to install, and that Russell, without a single day of formal engineering training, had built alone in a shed for a fraction of the cost. It was the engineer from Bozeman, a woman named Priya Anand who'd spent 2 decades consulting on irrigation systems across eastern Montana, who first said the word patent out loud, standing in that shed running her hand along a coupling joint with something close to disbelief on her face. She said she'd seen commercial systems that didn't do what this one did, said the flow regulation alone represented an approach she hadn't encountered in the literature, and asked more than once whether Russell had any formal background Wade hadn't mentioned. He didn't. He'd been an 8th-grade dropout who'd finished his schooling through a GED at 26 because Patsy pushed him into it, a man who'd spent his whole life reading equipment manuals and county extension pamphlets and teaching himself everything he needed to know by taking machines apart until he understood them. Wade thought about the equipment shed of his childhood, about the baler he used to strip down to nothing and rebuild just to see how it worked, and understood, with a feeling that landed somewhere between grief and something close to pride, exactly where that habit had come from. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sealed letter Russell had left at the law firm arrived by courier 4 days later, and Wade and Lena read it together on the porch of the house neither of them had grown up thinking of as belonging to just one of them. Russell's handwriting had grown shakier in his final years, but the words were plain, the way everything he ever said out loud had been plain, stripped of anything that might have sounded like an apology dressed up as an explanation. He wrote that he'd spent 17 years trying to build something that would prove the choice he'd made all those years ago wasn't really a choice between his children at all, that giving Lena the land and Wade the tools had never been about who deserved what, but about who could build the thing the ranch would eventually need to survive. He wrote that he should have said this decades earlier instead of making both of them carry the silence. He wrote that the machine only worked if the two of them worked it together. Lena's knowledge of the land and Wade's knowledge of the mechanics, neither half worth much without the other. The same way, he admitted neither of his children had ever been worth more to him than the other, no matter how badly his handling of things back then had made it look otherwise. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.